Hey everyone, welcome back to the arena. I'm MD, joined here by Covey, and once again, another really special guest.
Hey, so Matt here. We've got another super awesome guest. This is Amy Morin. She is a best-selling author of 5 books, I believe, working on the sixth. Most notably, I think her first book, 13 Things Mentally Strong People Don't Do. She and her work have been featured on all major media outlets, and if you want to get a quick, I would highly recommend you all go listen to her TED Talk, "The Secret of Becoming Mentally Strong," which is one of the most watched TED Talks of all time. Has more than 22 million views. But without further ado, maybe Amy, for our listeners, that haven't watched a TED Talk or read your book, can you just kind of provide a background on who you are, how you got to where you are today, and ultimately kind of what drove you to write your first book?
Sure. So if we back up to the beginning of my career, I was a therapist who lived in rural Maine. And if you fast forward to today, I'm an author who lives on a sailboat in the Florida Keys. But the in-between years were certainly not easy. So when I was 23 and just sort of getting into my therapy career, my mom passed away suddenly and unexpectedly. She had a brain aneurysm. And it was really my first dive into grief and how do you deal with loss. And a lot of the therapy skills I was teaching other people became more important than ever in my own life, and started trying to figure out, okay, how do you get through tough times? And it was it was 3 years to the day exactly, actually, that my 26-year-old husband passed away from a heart attack. And obviously you're not supposed to have a heart attack when you're 26. And I just remember waking up and I'm like, okay, now I'm a widow and I don't have my mom, and I'm supposed to be a therapist who helps other people deal with their problems. How's this going to work? Luckily, I was able to take 2 months off from work, which it's not nearly enough, but it at least gave me a couple of months to get some things in order. But it took years to work on myself and to figure out how to work through the pain. Our tendency is to go around it, to escape it, to distract ourselves. But I knew that part of the healing process is going through it. But I didn't want to stay stuck in that place of pain either. So spent a lot of time studying people who came into my therapy office, and as I was teaching them, I was also learning from them. And I figured out pretty quickly that it wasn't always what people did that helped them get through life and reach their greatest potential, not just for the bad times, but for the good times, but it was also what they didn't do. People who didn't have certain bad habits seemed to thrive. And so I tried to eliminate the bad habits in my own life too, things like feeling sorry for myself. And a few years down the road after that, I was like, all right, I've worked on myself. I'm going to see what's going to happen next. And I was fortunate enough to find love again, got a new job, got a new house, and life was looking pretty good for a minute. Then my father-in-law got diagnosed with terminal cancer. And I just remember thinking, like, this isn't fair. I just spent my entire 20s grieving, and I just don't have it in me to lose one more person. Like, how can this keep happening? And that day, I sat down and I wrote myself a letter of what mentally strong people don't do. And when I was done, there were 13 things on the list. And I just sort of tucked it in my pocket and read it to myself. And that's how I got through those early days, as I would just wake up and read that list and say, okay, Amy, if you just don't do these things today, you'll be okay. And then I found the list helpful, so I thought maybe I'll publish it online and see what happens. And 50 million people read that list. It led to my first book, which is also called 13 Things Mentally Strong People Don't Do. And that's why 10 years now later, since I wrote that list, I still get to talk to you about mental strength. And as you say, I did a TEDx talk, and I'm currently finishing up book number 6 as we speak.
Would you say did you write them in order in terms of most important? Was there maybe one specifically that you struggled with in terms of, what people don't do more than others?
Yeah, since the list was really just a letter to myself, I think I struggled with, I wrote the list in the order that I was struggling with at the moment, which is why Don't Feel Sorry for Yourself is number 1 on the list, because I was in that moment where I was like, this isn't fair, my life shouldn't be like this, and I was just resisting everything that was going on, and that made me put that as number 1 on the list. And then when I wrote the book, I kept it true to the list. It's in the same order, but at the moment in time when I wrote it, those were the most important things to me, or the things I was struggling with the most.
Yeah, well, Amy, I thank you for explaining that. I, don't mean to have you go and continue to revisit that, but you did mention something along the lines of, if I just read this list, I'll be okay. And, you did mention how you were already into your therapy career. And so not to suggest that there's any way to prepare for such events and for such grief, but, having been prepared, what then became the goal when you say, I just want to be okay at this point, or if I just read this, I'll be okay. What's the goal in your mind every day when you say that?
Yeah, I'm glad you brought that up, because sometimes people will say, well, it's okay not to be okay. Well, and by okay, I don't mean like, hey, I'm going to have a great day today. This is going to be amazing. My goal was to just, I think, have faith and trust that yes, this is going to be painful and it's going to be really hard and I might need help, but I'm not going to die too. Like, the emotional pain is awful, but yet somehow I'm going to do everything I can to work through it and to face it. And I knew it was going to be awful and painful, and it was, but just by reading that list and saying, okay, I'm going to be okay today, because I knew I could just avoid things. Like, there's so many lists of things you should do in life. And I was overwhelmed and I felt awful. And the last thing I wanted was like a list of 50 more things I should be doing, because I already felt too overwhelmed to add any more to my to-do list. But as long as I said is just don't do these things today and you'll get through it, like, that helped me get through that day. And I wasn't looking forward to like, where am I going to be in 10 years for sure. I just wanted to get through today. And knowing what was going to happen, like, there's not a good way or a bad way to lose somebody, whether you know it's coming or it's sudden or unexpected. But I had lost my mom and my husband really unexpectedly. But when it came to my father-in-law, they told us, oh, he probably has a couple months left. And like, the dread of knowing what I was going to face was terrible as well. And so I was just thinking, like, how do you get through this awful dread and time in my life when I know I'm going to feel even worse at some point fairly soon? And it was shortly after I wrote the list that my father-in-law passed away. But I knew what was coming. And so for me to be able to say, okay, I'm going to be okay today, it was just, if I read this list, I will somehow get through today, even though it's going to be terrible, horrible, and awful.
And, follow-up question just on not feeling sorry for myself, right? In those times, I'm sure you have some support network that is delivering you sympathy. Does it make it more difficult or more welcoming to sympathy, right? Do you still welcome in that sympathy? Did that create opportunities to remind you of, I'll welcome this, but at the same time, I'm not going to feel it for myself? Or how did you think about kind of the interaction or the intersection between not feeling sorry for myself, as well as, I'm sure that, hopefully there was sympathy delivered towards you?
Oh, that's a good question. So I wanted to be sad. I know that sadness is part of the healing process, but self-pity is when you're like, oh, my life is worse than anybody else's, nothing can be done, and you become hopeless and helpless. And while I certainly had supportive people in my life, I'm in a fortunate position where some of my best friends from childhood are still my best friends to this day. And I have some pretty cool family members too, but I also didn't want other people to feel sorry for me. Like, I just thought, now people are going to be like, oh no, what's going to happen to Amy next? And I didn't want people like, giving me something because they felt bad for me, like, just because they thought I couldn't cope or that I couldn't get through this, or so I guess I wanted empathy, but I didn't necessarily want sympathy. And I can remember in those early days too, after my husband passed away, and I was just like, oh, all these people, they were very kind to me and did wonderful things for me, but I didn't want them to be like, oh no, what's Amy doing now? We can't leave her home alone, and only spend time with me because they felt sorry for me or anything like that. And so that was an interesting thing to be on the other end of it. As a therapist, I was used to giving support, and I was used to listening to people's stories. I wasn't used to telling my story or asking a lot of people for help, or really depending on social support and friends and family, but they were vital in terms of my healing for sure. And there's tons of research on that when we go through tough times, the amount of social support we have can help us, can be a buffer against things like PTSD, depression, anxiety when you go through tough times. But it's hard to ask for help, or sometimes we don't have people to talk to or people who can relate to us. And I never fault anybody who doesn't know what to say, but when somebody's going through a tough time, I still don't have the words to say to somebody else either, when people are like, someday you'll get remarried, or things will get better, or things that are supposed to be well-intentioned but at the moment may not be all that well received. But I know it's tough to know what to say to people or how to help them.
So did you find it easier to be more left alone, or did you find it easier to be surrounded by a network of support that maybe at times didn't always say the right things or delivered sympathy when you were looking for empathy?
I still found it better to be around people for sure. And I, as a therapist, I was forgiving of people who maybe said things that weren't all that helpful in the moment, because what do you say? Sometimes there just are no words. And there were times when I wanted to be alone, but certainly times when I didn't want to be alone. And it's tough to call somebody and be like, hey, I'm feeling really lonely today. You think we could hang out? Because you're like, I don't really want somebody to just, go out to dinner with me because they feel bad for me. But people also don't know what to do. The amount of people who say, like, call me if you need me, or let me know if you need anything. And it's often they're more than willing to help. They just don't know what to offer. But if you ask for it, people are usually so willing to say, oh, like, it could be something as simple as, can you go to the grocery store with me because I'm not having a great day? And when you ask those questions, people are usually very willing to do those things, because then they feel like they're being useful and helpful.
Yeah, no, it's a good point on the idea of sympathy, because there was a point in my life, actually most of my life, where I did want sympathy. I always thought of it as like, when it relates to my sexuality, it was like, I played the victim card in the sense of like, if someone's struggling, and this was a naive way of thinking, but if someone's struggling with their weight, it's like, well, they have the capability to lose weight. Like, that's in their power. And I remember I was telling my therapist, this is like, for me, I can't change, who I am. And that's how I played that role of like, the victim card. And I offered sympathy into my life. And it's like, now where I'm at, if I do share my story, I really don't look for, if someone says, oh, I'm so sorry you have to deal with that. It's like, well, I don't really want that doesn't really help me, because I'm grateful that I got to go through that, because I would not be where I'm at today, mentally, what I've learned from being kind of in that space, had I not gone through that experience. So I can totally relate. And like, I think maybe empathy was a better word. Like, when I did open up to people, I wasn't looking, they didn't say, I'm sorry, they had to deal with that. It was more of like, I'm proud of you for doing this. I respect you more for doing this. And like, that's what I needed to hear.
Right. Yeah, absolutely. I think when somebody says like, or we'll get through this, or I'm going to be here for you anyway, or I'm with you, any of those things are, all right, somebody, maybe they don't feel the same things, maybe they can't completely understand what you're going through, but they're going to hang in there with you. It's super important.
When you said you just needed to, you just wanted to be okay, was that because you knew that you'd be stronger on the other side of things? Because, when I went through my self-healing journey, I didn't know that this was going to be the result. I just knew that I couldn't deal with that thing hanging around me any longer, but I didn't know that it was going to lead to this. Did you know, like, from being a therapist, from studying this stuff, that, you kind of need to process those dark times, and often when you do, you end up stronger on the other side?
Yeah, I knew that. I'd seen some people who went through tough times, and like, on the other side of it, they were still really kind and nice and patient people. But I saw other people who were bitter and angry and resentful. And I guess my goal was to just not become a bitter, angry, and resentful person on the other side of this, as I thought, I don't want to spend the rest of my life just being angry that this decade of my life was awful. I didn't want to feel like something had been robbed of me, and therefore I could never be happy, or that I could never go out and do some pretty cool things. My life is better than I dreamed it would have been at that point, especially, but my goal, I think, was to just make sure that I was still like felt like I was okay at some point in my life. I knew it was going to be a while to get there, but I just didn't want to spend all those years, because I would see people who had been through tough times, and it might be 30 years later, and they were just bitter and angry about it, and felt like, this one thing happened and therefore I can never enjoy life again. And they dug in their heels and kind of made it so that they never put themselves out there. They never tried. And it was often because they had this belief that life is now ruined. And because they believed that, their behavior became such that they made sure life was really rough from that moment on. And whether it was they were punishing themselves about something, or they just felt like they needed to prove to the planet that one thing that happened was so awful that life could never be good again, for whatever reason they stayed stuck. And I just didn't want to stay stuck.
Yeah, I really want to get back to that because I do want to bring up in your book you bring up locus of control, and somebody who's a little bit more internally or internal locus of control is maybe taking more control or having more choice into how they ultimately want to view the world and be as a person. I do want to get back to that, but I do also want to learn a little bit more about your background. Just help us understand what made you go into becoming a therapist, because all of these events happened as your career had started, but curious what led to you wanting to be a therapist in the first place.
Well, I had always grown up with parents who, both of my parents worked for the post office in rural Maine, and they were both postmasters. And my mom was sort of like an unofficial social worker. And like, I didn't even realize the extent of it, I think, until my later years. But like, if somebody came in and she knew everybody, it was a small town. So she knew everybody in this small town and often knew their stories and their struggles. And so sometimes people would come in and say, my check didn't come in this week and I'm not sure how I'm going to get through the weekend, and I have kids. And so my mom would give them money out of her purse. And she never bragged about it, that sort of a thing. And again, I didn't really it was her funeral where I really realized the extent of it. But she had taught my sister and I growing up, like, there are people who need help out there. And if you have the ability to help them, then that's your job. So I'd kind of grown up with that mentality. But I thought I was going to be a doctor. In fact, even my first day of college, I was a pre-med student. But we had to dissect cats, and everybody else in the class was super excited about dissecting cats, and I wasn't. And I, like, in that moment was like, I actually don't want to be a doctor. I just like the idea of being a doctor. My sister had just graduated with a bachelor's degree in psychology, so I called her and I said, hey, I need a new major quick. I'm thinking psychology. What do you think? And she said, at least go into social work, because then you get a license when you're done, because a bachelor's in psychology is a little vague. So, okay, great. So I signed up for social work the next day, basically so I didn't have to dissect a cat, but fell in love with it. And 4 years later, I was like, this is cool. So if I go on to get my master's, I could be a therapist. And then around the same time, my sister decided to get her master's in social work. So both of us did. And we used to have offices next door to each other. Because I think at some point I realized, yes, I would like to help people. And so I had thought maybe a doctor is a good way to help people. But along the way, I learned that was not my area of expertise. It's not something I'm actually interested in, but talking to people is pretty cool. So I made that switch to say, yeah, let's sit in an office and talk to people, deal with their emotional problems and mental health issues as opposed to physical health.
I've met a lot of people who are very people service oriented, always thinking about how to help other people. Oftentimes what I've noticed with those people is that they can neglect themselves, or it's almost deployed as a distraction to avoid maybe internal issues or things that they're going through in their own personal life. I don't think that was your case. I think you had an upbringing that you watched your mother, do things in certain ways that perhaps conditioned you to also want to to serve other people. Just curious, did you have to also develop an understanding and knowledge around the importance of taking care of yourself? Was that always there with your passion for helping others, or is that something you learned later in life?
I think fortunately my parents always were into fun as well. So as much as we helped other people, like, they were always encouraging us to do fun things, which as a kid, that's some pretty cool self-care when you get to do fun stuff. And so I've always prioritized fun in life. And I'm grateful to that, because that's certainly been in line with my personality too, to say, yeah, let's make sure that we have plenty of fun while we're doing it. Hence, I live on a sailboat and I get to podcast from a sailboat now, so that's fun. But there's definitely been times in life where it's more difficult. And when I was working as a therapist 40 hours a week, plus I had another side job, and I almost always had at least one or two side jobs or side hustles or something going on, there would be times where I definitely felt like I was headed toward burnout if I didn't do something differently, or if I didn't put on the brakes, or if I didn't manage my time better. And I think that, being an entrepreneur now and being out on my own as an author and a podcaster, like the idea of self-care kind of gets blended in, because work and life become blurry when you podcast from your living room. And so it's still an ongoing thing where I just have to be careful of how I'm doing with that in terms of, am I getting enough exercise? Am I eating healthy enough? Am I still doing enough fun things, even though I love my work, but I don't want to work 24/7?
So I guess let's talk a little bit, because I think it's the building block of a lot of what we're talking about here, self-awareness. How can one, I mean, I think therapy is one, it worked for me more than anything, but how can people just generally become more self-aware? Because I think without that, a lot of what we're talking about isn't going to prove as beneficial if we're not being honest with ourselves and who we really are.
Absolutely. And I obviously, as a therapist, I love the idea of going to therapy, because often a therapist will say, they'll point out the inconsistencies. You walk in and you say, I'm a really honest person, but then the next story is about how you cheated on your taxes 3 years ago. And a therapist can help point out those things, the labels maybe that we've carried around that aren't always true, or the beliefs we have about how we're seen, how we're perceived by other people. But in lieu of that, I don't think everybody needs to go to therapy or anything like that, because we can learn a lot about ourselves. So some strategies that are fairly simple and anybody can do, but they're difficult to keep practicing on an ongoing basis. But one is just labeling your feelings. If you check in with yourself a couple times a day and say, how am I feeling right now? And it might be when you brush your teeth, hopefully in the morning and hopefully again at night. And for a lot of people, it's about saying, I'm going to print out a list of feeling words, because it's hard to even name feelings because we don't talk about emotions. So people will say happy, sad, mad, and then they kind of run out of emotions after that. But if you tape a list to your bathroom mirror and just check in with yourself twice a day, how am I feeling today? And for a lot of people, that's eye-opening. And they realize, well, I'm happy about this thing I'm about to do, but I'm kind of sad about this thing I'm leaving behind. You can feel two things at once, and emotions are contrary to each other sometimes. Like, hey, I'm like really excited about this new thing, but I'm also really anxious about it. Or I'm happy about one thing, but also like really angry about something else. You can feel lots of different things at once, and we just start to learn more. And then when you start to pay attention to your emotions, then you can take stock of how might this be affecting my decisions. Like, I'm anxious today because I'm worried about, maybe you're worried about a family member's health issue. Well, that spills over into the rest of your life. So if your boss comes to you and says, hey, do you want to try this new project? You're, nope, no, I'm good, thanks. It's because anxiety from one area of your life spills over into other areas. There's tons of research on this. But when we get more in tune with our emotions, we can start to realize that, oh, okay, so when I'm anxious, this is what I do. And to then also just become more aware of the thoughts that run through our head. For the most part, we have a lot of repetitive thoughts, same kinds of thoughts over and over again. You might rehash conversations that you had earlier, or you might always be thinking about what you have to do next, or your to-do list, or maybe you're always beating yourself up or second guessing. But a lot of people don't realize what their thought patterns are, so sometimes just writing down in a diary, or you keep a log for a week of the thoughts you have and just sorting them out. People really become aware quickly of, oh, I think the same things over and over again. Isn't that a terrible use of my brain power? But once you become aware of it, you can start to make some changes. And then same with your behavior. Pay attention to your behavior. So raising your self-awareness might be just getting an app on your phone, or you probably already have one that tells you how much time you spend on the phone during the day. I find people grossly underestimate how many hours they spend on their phone. That's a great way to raise self-awareness, is saying, let's just become more aware of your behavior. How much time do you spend talking, or how much time do you spend texting versus how much time do you spend watching TV? So if somebody just keeps a log of their time for a couple of weeks, that can give you some pretty good insight too.
What about for the people, and I'm only saying this because it used to be me, that are emotionless? Like for a long time, I think because I had suppressed so much feeling, like I was pretty numb to emotions. Like I would really never get happy, and I would really never get sad. I was just kind of gliding through life, letting life happen to me. Like, what's the next step there?
So then the next step can be no worries at all. We're not even going to name your emotion. We're going to give you a mood thermometer from 1 to 10 and just ask you, what's your number for today? I find a lot of people who can't really say like, oh, I'm angry or I'm kind of anxious. They can say I'm a 4. I'm like a solid 4 today. And they say, okay, well, what would it take to get you up to a 6? And sometimes we'll do something where we'll say, well, let's say you woke up one day and your mood was like an 8. What would you do that day? I might go for a walk, call my friends, go out for coffee, whatever it is. Make a list of what you do on an 8, 9, or a 10 day. And then when you wake up someday and your mood's at more like a 2, pick something off of that list from your list of what you do when it's an 8, and you can boost your mood. There's so many things we can do to improve our mood, to feel better. Obviously, that's not the goal of life, isn't to just be constantly happy all the time. But when your emotions aren't serving you well, you wake up on the wrong side of the bed on a Monday morning, and you know you're going to end up going to work grumpy, and it's not going to go well, because if you're grumpy all day long, people don't treat you well, and people don't treat you well, you don't treat them well back, and the cycle continues. Like, all right, what could I do to make my day a little bit better? Maybe you wear your favorite shirt, or you listen to really upbeat music on your way into the office. Just find these little things that you can do, so you say, I'm going to put my best foot forward so I can have the best day possible today.
Amy, in your experience working with men who have gone and sought therapy, I'm just curious if you noticed any trends at all. And some hypothetical examples that come to mind are they all had to get to the point of therapy and they've waited a very long time and there was a certain why. Or maybe it's a certain trait that you saw. Again, this is super generalizing, but maybe there's a trait. It's insecurity against the social pressures, or there's too much pride to fully open up and actually do the process correctly. From what I hear, it's you don't just show up and get healed. You have to actually show up and be present and put a lot of work into self-development in those sessions. Just anything that you noticed. We obviously have a very broad audience and we're very close to men, and we really want them, to be able to hear from your side of things and from your wisdom and experience. Anything you've noticed on a kind of a trend level?
Well, when I started my therapy career 20 years ago in rural Maine, and when I say rural, we're talking population 3,000 people in the town, men were very resistant to coming to therapy. And if they did, there was a lot of embarrassment over, what if I see somebody I know in the waiting room, or if my vehicle's parked outside, somebody might recognize it. Yeah. and so people were just really like, what time's the best time of day to come in when there's nobody here? Those sorts of questions. It's definitely, that stigma I think has gotten better for sure over the past 20 years, where people aren't quite as embarrassed, and I think that's in general, but I would say with men especially. And it used to be more about anger. I would see men when somebody else said to them, you have to go get some help, whether it was their partner or their employer or somebody else in their life was often driving them to come to therapy, whether they thought they needed it or not. They were willing to do it because they wanted somebody else to leave them alone, or for me to convince their partner or their employer that they were fine. Anxiety is by far the most common reason these days that I'm seeing everybody in the office, but men in particular. And substance abuse is another big one. And I think that's a lot of it is just years of untreated struggles. And so people are self-medicating at home with drugs and alcohol and many other things to try to shove those feelings down, suppress them, push them back, or do whatever they can to not have to deal with them. But universally, almost everybody who comes into the office will say that, like, getting to that first appointment was the hardest part. Once they do that, it's not nearly as bad as they imagined.
Yeah, and it's interesting because you bring up emotions or traits, anger, anxiety. Were these event-based? Like, was there a breaking point that, an event or a situation happened, and then they were like, okay, too much damage has been done, now I actually need to go and get help? Or was it just as, maybe not simple, but was it as passive as just a partner recommendation or an employer recommendation?
I would say there was a mixture. Sometimes there was an event. Somebody threw something out of anger and other people said, whoa, that's not okay. You have to go get some help. Other times it was like somebody just coming to the realization of, I come home from work and I yell at my kids every day. I don't want to be that dad. Or I'm just like really impatient and short with people, and I think I'm becoming kind of a mean person, so I need to get help with that. So it depended. Sometimes it was a single event. Sometimes it was just like a bunch of things happening and piling up all at once, and finally somebody said, enough's enough. I have to do something about this.
And the ones that are more like referral based, like you have to go here to get therapy, I'm sure are much more difficult clientele base, because they're not necessarily ready, versus the ones that are coming to you because they want willingly. And to your point on people wanting to go to therapy, like when there was no one else around, like I can relate. I took my first therapy appointment at my sister's place and I lived with MD at the time because I didn't want him to even know that this was a possibility. So I totally relate. And once I got through the first one, it eventually got to a point where I would take him there, but I'd make sure he wasn't there. Then it got to a point where I was like, oh, you're here? I don't care. You can listen. Whatever it might be.
But any time you tell this story, I always have to clarify, this was all in his head. I never said anything about how I would think.
Oh, no. I mean, that's the story of my life, though. I mean, I knew my parents would be supportive of me. I knew my sisters would be supportive of me. Like, they're my best friends, but I just didn't like it in myself. So it didn't matter what other people thought. Ultimately, it was a me thing. There's something I want to touch on that really stuck with me in your book, and I'm going to read the quote, and I'd just love for you to elaborate on this because I feel like I see it all the time. And it's the quote is, most of us wrongly assume that, and this is around people pleasing, that people pleasing behavior proves we're generous. But when you think about it, always trying to please people isn't a selfless act. It's actually quite self-centered. Can you just elaborate on it? Because I understand it, but I think a lot of other people struggle to grasp that concept, and I'd love to just hear your perspective on that.
Yeah, it's one of the most common misconceptions, I think. People come in my therapy office and say, like, I really want to work on setting some boundaries, but I don't want to be selfish. Like, no, it's okay to set boundaries. In fact, when you teach other people how you want to be treated, like, they don't have to guess anymore. So if you say to somebody, yes, I will love to hang out with you and I'm going to take my own car because I'm going to leave when I want, or you say to somebody, like, I'm okay if you come over, but please call first. Oh, okay, that clears it up. But I also want people in my life to say no to me. If I call you and say, hey, do you want to go watch a movie? And you really don't want to go, I want you to say no. The last thing I want is for you to come and be like, oh, the last thing I want to do is go to the movies with Amy, but I'm going to go because she'll be so crushed in life if I say no that she can't handle it. And that's where a lot of, like, people pleasing comes from. We think, I have the power to make or break your life, and if I said no to you, you'd be so crushed that you couldn't get over it. Like, no, I'm not that powerful. If I say no to you, you'll probably find a way to get over that. Or if I do something that you don't like, I want you to be able to tell me, like, oh yeah, I don't like it when you do that, because again, takes out a lot of the guesswork for me. But when we're people pleasing, sometimes we want recognition. We want other people to acknowledge how cool we are, how amazing it is that we do everything. We want to look like a hero. So it really is somewhat self-centered sometimes when we try to say yes to everything. We don't set boundaries. We let people treat us poorly in different ways just because we think that there'll be some sort of recognition in it for us.
And is that does that come from a place of, when we say it's self-centered, right? Is the person just deemed selfish right there, or is it just a lack of awareness around it?
Insecurity, maybe?
Or is it more of just I'm seeking a sense of belonging? Because obviously, a lot of people, some would argue that's a need in the pyramid, right? Is a sense of belonging. And so they are constantly seeking acceptance, recognition, compliments. So how do we balance viewing that as, what we'll call self-centered versus somebody who's maybe just unaware, seeking a sense of belonging? Or maybe it's one and the same.
Yeah, I think you raise a lot of good points. And I think, again, when I make a decision and I base it on what the outcome is going to be for me, how much achievement, recognition, it's probably because I have some low self-esteem issues. And I'm just hoping that if I do enough, other people will like me, which goes to your point of then I might feel like I belong or I fit in or that I'm part of the club. And so I put myself out there to do all these extras, hoping for that. But we know that usually doesn't happen, which is why people pleasing becomes a chronic issue, because people are like, oh, I still didn't get what I was looking for, so I'll do 5 more things and then maybe I'll get it. And even if you get it for a moment where somebody says, I am just so impressed with your work, Matt. You've done such amazing things because you stay late and you are the first to come in the morning, and that feels good for a minute. But it doesn't last. So then what happens tomorrow when we wake up? We're like, I'm going to do that again. And it leads to this cycle that's kind of never ending. And there's some interesting research too about the desire to always get more, to feel like that next hurdle is going to be we're going to finally feel good when we cross the line. And then you cross the line and it lasts for a very short period of time. And then you feel like you have to keep going.
Yeah. And I almost feel like, because I've had conversations with people, new people I'm meeting, I've been on dates, for example, and it's I'll tell them what I like to do, my hobbies, or my perspective on something, or I'm passionate about mental health, and when all I hear back is, oh, me too, me too. It's like I get this sense, it almost like lacks authenticity to me, because like I feel like that's another people pleasing quality, is trying to be almost too agreeable, where it just doesn't feel real then, and it almost kind of has the opposite effect, at least on it has on me. Have you seen that at all?
Yeah, and it seems like a weird thing to talk about right now, like, oh, people are just too agreeable these days. Because if you look on social media, you'll see pretty quickly that a lot of people aren't too agreeable. But on the other hand, sometimes we are like that. When we want to be liked, we're really quick to be like, I love skiing too, even though I've skied like twice in my life. But there is a part of us that wants to belong. We want to be liked, so we put different parts of ourselves out there. But with that said, like, we're not all just one way or another, right? Like, there's research that would show if you sit next to a stranger on a plane, you're much more likely to tell that person secrets that you've never even told your friends or your family, because this person has no preconceived notions about you. But when it comes to like our friends, our family, people that we know, sometimes we're like, oh, this person knows me as as the outgoing one, or they know me as the fun one, so I don't want to let them in on all these different parts of my life because that doesn't maybe fit the label that they have or the way that they see me. So then when we meet new people, we're kind of like, ooh, how do I want to be seen? Like, what kind of light do I want you to see me in? And sometimes we're tempted then to only show certain parts of us because we think that's the part of us that this person will like the best.
Yeah, I like to think in scales, or in spectrums, and it sounds like a lot of what we're talking about is like the more that somebody's overly agreeing, the more that they go with the grain instead of against the grain, and the more that they people please at expense for themselves, it seems to be the more insecure they really perhaps are. And it's just interesting that our eyes, we view outward, we see the world externally, and so we perhaps will first think that the solution therein lies externally. Like you had mentioned, Amy, I'm going to show up to work again and get that dopamine hit, or etc. But really the solution more so lies from within, which, is so close yet so far because we don't see from within. And it just takes one conversation with somebody to kind of help calibrate that vision a bit. It's just really interesting to hear this kind of conversation evolve into that direction.
And, as kids, that's what we're usually taught, right? You get a good grade on your test, and the teacher gives you the blue ribbon, and you get perfect attendance. And we start to think achievement's really the solution to finally feeling good about ourselves. And we had this quote-unquote self-esteem crisis of the 80s and the 90s, where people thought, if we just say, you're the fastest runner and the smartest kid in the whole school, then somehow that will compound any negative messages you get in life. But I think we're seeing the results of that these days, that didn't really work.
And I bring that up only because that's where I feel I relate the most, and as we talk about these things, is more now than ever in my entire life, I'm more against the grain. I'm like my own individual at this point. I really love the quote around like the less normal you are, the more interesting you are. And I equate that also, or I associate that also. I've never been more confident in my life than I am today. And so it really is just a very direct relationship. Not to say that there aren't other circumstances or more variables to that equation, but it's certainly been apparent to me, just a very transformative past 6 months for myself versus looking and viewing who I was just a short time ago.
Yeah, no. So Amy, there's another thing that you mentioned, I think, on another podcast that and we can talk about the locus of control as well, but this one resonated with me as well a little bit, and it's around venting. And I think a lot of our audience will be able to relate to this, but I personally don't vent very much or feel the need to, but when in the times I do, I get this, like, I feel like it does help me. And I think what you had said is like, this is actually not really helping us. And so can you just elaborate on that a little bit, and maybe what is the more productive conversation that should be had when we want to just complain?
Right. And I'm glad you brought that one up too, because that seems to be one of the biggest misconceptions. People think that they're like a pressure cooker, and if they don't vent, then somehow they're holding everything in and they're going to explode. But there is definitely something wise about processing things. I mean, I'm a therapist, so people come in and talk to me about stuff, and I don't say you're venting. We work through it. We process it. We might identify their emotions. We might problem solve something. We might talk about a different way to look at it. But venting is when you've had a bad day at work and maybe you call your mom on the ride home and tell her your boss is an idiot and here's all the reasons why. You hang the phone up with her and you immediately then call another friend and rehash the exact same thing. And you think, what am I trying to get out of this? And just rehashing, ruminating, and replaying and recounting a story over and over and over again, that just adds more fuel to the fire. It keeps us stuck. So I think it's important to say, yes, am I somehow problem solving? Am I looking for another perspective? Maybe you call your friend and you really want to say like, hey, I'm dealing with this work issue. This is what's going on. Or maybe you just want some emotional support where you say, I'm struggling with this at work. And your friend says, yeah, I've struggled with that too. And you feel like, oh, okay, we kind of understand each other. They can relate to me. That can be helpful. But it's really when you notice, I'm not actually diffusing the situation. I'm just adding more fuel to my anger, my aggression, and my frustration. And when we keep rehashing the same thing over and over, or sometimes people get caught up in this cycle of coming home from work, or these days where a lot of people work from home, just recounting to their partner all the horrible things that just happened during the workday. And then the next day they recount all the terrible things that happened at work again. And it gets you stuck in this cycle of negativity because then all you see is your work is something horrible to get through every day. So you just need to change that up a little bit. So maybe you start telling your partner, here's actually the best part of my day. And you don't have to talk about all the times your coworkers annoyed you or all the things that were unfair. And if you don't tell your partner about all those things, it doesn't mean that you're going to explode. It just means, hey, I'm going to choose to focus on the more positive aspects of my day sometimes too.
For our listeners, because, we've all had our own experiences, but we hear terms or phrasing such as, well, we need healthier ways to process these emotions or address these emotions. Amy, whether it's your grief in your life, Kobe, whether it's your shame, whether it's my insecurities, etc., can you help define what you mean by processing an emotion or addressing an emotion properly?
Sure. So it could be anything from just acknowledging and naming a feeling. We know from research, if you can put a label on it, it takes a lot of the sting out of it. So like we said before, for some people, just having that sign on your bathroom mirror with feeling words. When you say, I'm actually kind of anxious today, helps your brain and your body make sense of what's going on because you've released all these stress hormones and your brain's trying to figure out, is this a health issue? What's happening? Oh, it's anxiety. And then your anxiety decreases just a little bit. And then you can make a decision, what am I going to do with that anxiety? Am I going to go running? Am I going to call a friend? Do I want to sit down, relax, and watch something funny on TV to purposely get through that? Or is my anxiety helpful? And a question we'll often talk about in the therapy office is emotions aren't either positive or negative. There's so much out there that says that, excitement's a positive emotion and anger is a negative emotion. But that's not true at all. If I came to you with a get-rich-quick scheme and got you really excited about it, you might say, hey, that sounds like a good idea. And even though it's really stupid, you might sign up for it because you're so excited you can't see the downside. Well, anger is very similar. Maybe when you're angry and you see somebody being mistreated, it gives you courage. But when you're really angry at somebody standing right there in front of you, then you might say really mean things sometimes too. So when we're processing an emotion, we might acknowledge what it is we're feeling, figure out how's this affecting how I think, because it can affect your judgment. And then what am I going to do about it? Maybe you're sad because you just lost something like a job. So it's okay to be sad for a little while. But maybe you're so sad you can't get out of bed. So you think, all right, I really have to push myself to go outside and go for a walk. So when we're processing an emotion, we're just kind of figuring out, how do I make sense of what's going on? How's it affecting my brain and my body? And what am I going to do about it, if anything at all?
Wow, I love that. I never viewed emotions as, I guess, neutral, and they're positive or negative based on what you do with them ultimately, and that's just so important to hear.
Yeah, I think so many people think oh, it's bad to feel this way. No, your anxiety might keep you safe too. If somebody tells you to go jump off a bridge, your anxiety might kick in and say, that's a bad idea.
Or anger might be motivating.
Exactly.
Yeah, no, it's interesting because I just started doing this with labeling emotions, and I remember being in Italy, and I was like, wow, I'm feeling a little, and I was feeling very grateful the whole trip, but there was one time where I was feeling a little bit down. And I'm why am I feeling just less talkative, less social? And I actually reflected and I was oh, it's because I'm very routine oriented and I haven't been able to exercise in 3 days. And it just labeling that idea of and figuring out why I was feeling the way I was, like, helped so much. And it was like, okay, this is temporary though. And like, you know, and then there's like, I was like, well, I also feel a little bit of guilt because like I'm on this amazing trip and here I am feeling a little bit down. But just labeling how I was feeling and understanding that this was ultimately a temporary feeling, a fleeting feeling, helped me like tremendously. Now that wasn't easy to do, and I wouldn't have done that a year ago, but it just goes to your point, like it helped me so much.
And I like that idea too, just recognizing feelings don't last forever. Sometimes we think that they will. When you're really, really anxious about something, you might start thinking like, I can't stand this, I have to fix it right away. It won't last forever. They kind of come and go. And just reminding ourselves of that can be really helpful sometimes.
Amy, something I'm sort of struggling to reconcile as I continue to grow my own knowledge of the mental health sphere is how to balance the relationship between your feelings and traits such as like discipline. Some would say on discipline side is you do things regardless of how you feel. Some would say on the feeling side is, hey, your feelings are valid and there are ways that we need to welcome these into our lives and into our world and exist with them a certain way. What is in your eyes the relationship between, let's call discipline the example here, discipline and our feelings?
Oh, that's a great question. So it all depends, right? Like because people will talk about that with mental strength. Like if I'm tired today, is it mentally stronger to stay home from the gym because I'm practicing self-care? Or is it mentally stronger to say I'm tired and I'm going to push through and force myself to go to the gym anyway? And the answer is it depends, right? If you're somebody who's like, I'm only going to go to the gym on the days I feel like it, you probably go twice a year. But on the other hand, if you're somebody who says, I'm going to go 7 days a week no matter what, and you drag yourself there when you're injured and you push yourself to keep going at all costs, well, then probably staying home is where you want to be. So I think there's a balance to be made. And again, this goes back to that self-awareness piece and knowing, am I somebody who needs to practice more self-discipline despite how I feel? Or am I somebody who's so rigid and regimented that I can't take a step back and honor my feelings? And we want to make sure that we have that balance in life, but also to just be aware of those different areas of our life. Like some people, when it comes to, say, going to the gym, they're good at finding a balance. Other people say, yeah, I can do that while I'm going to the gym, but let's take money. Maybe somebody's really rigid with money and all their decisions are based on logic alone, and they see something and they're like, oh, I don't want to spend $20 on that because that's a splurge, and they can't, even though it would be exciting and it's fun. They just have to rule that area of their life with logic. But we know we make our best decisions when logic and emotions are in balance. So if somebody said, I'm going to strive for going to the gym 5 days a week, and they come to that conclusion and that's your goal, well, then on that third day, on Wednesday rolls around and you're like, I don't really want to go, probably makes sense to push you through it. And you can shift and adjust. You might decide maybe 3 days a week is a better balance for you later on. Or you might decide, I kind of like going to the gym 5 days, but on the weekends I'm also going to go hiking and go for a walk because that's cool too, and that's best for managing my overall life. So I think it's about finding that balance and just being more aware of what our goals are and the times when it's okay to step back and the times we should push ourselves to step up.
Is that, so should we think about that the same way when you going back to venting, like a combination of logic and emotions? Because is that when venting becomes unproductive? It's when it's all emotionally driven? And we should think about maybe trying to add some logic in there, like, okay, I'm feeling this and this happened, but like, what can we do about it? And trying to add some logic in there.
Yes, so we know that we make our best decisions, again, when emotion and logic are somewhat balanced. And when our emotions get really high, logic goes out the window. If somebody gave you an IQ test when you were really angry, you'd score poorly on it. Like, it literally makes you stupid to be angry. And so you don't want to make a decision about your future just because you're really angry one day. You want to make sure maybe you wait till you're a little calmer and you can step back and think about it. So with all of the things we have going on, sometimes we just need to say, do I need to raise my logic? Like when I get anxiety, my anxiety gets high. Like I can't think clearly. I'm like, my goal is to just get away from the anxiety in that moment. But if I sat and I wrote down like a list of reasons, like let's say I'm going to give a speech and I'm terrified to get up on stage. My anxiety could talk me out of that, but maybe I'm supposed to be up on stage in an hour and I really don't want to back out, but my anxiety's all, no, you don't feel well today, or you're kind of tired. Maybe I sit down and I write a list of here's the 10 reasons why I should still get on stage today, even though I don't feel well. And just having that list of logical reasons can push us to do something that we don't want to do. On the flip side, when maybe I'm trying to make a decision like, should I go on this vacation next year? Logically, maybe I'm looking at my budget and I'm like, $2,000 to go on this vacation with my friends. That's a lot of money, so I'm not going to go. Maybe I haven't done anything fun with my friends in years, and this would be life altering to be able to say, yeah, I went on this amazing trip. So maybe I need to then say, how am I going to feel on this trip? And you need to balance it out a little bit more with the emotions, so we aren't just, life gets really boring if you do it on logic alone, but life gets a little too scary if you make it on emotion alone. So you just want to make sure that you have that balance in there.
That's great. Sorry, that was my follow-up question is there ever too much logic?
Yes.
And it sounds like
yes.
the answer is yes.
Point taken.
Right. Sometimes people just have this like a really serious, boring life because it doesn't make sense to, fall in love. It doesn't make sense to do certain things. And some of the best things in life are those exciting, fun things that we do that don't always make 100% logical sense.
So what's your advice to somebody who's on the furthest end of that spectrum, is all 100% logic, zero emotion?
Are you thinking of anyone?
No, not at all. Myself a little bit.
Right? And so I think in those cases, if everything's too logical all the time, then to just think about, like, how would I feel? Somebody says, hey, you should buy this thing for your house, or this car that would be a lot of fun. And you're like, it's slightly outside my budget, so there's no way I would ever do it. Or you just say no to things that could be kind of cool because logically it doesn't make sense. Well, what's the price that you're paying for being 100% logical? Maybe you're missing out on some really cool things in life. Sometimes some psychological distance helps too, because I tend to be much more, I think, on the logical end of things most of the time, and I have to remind myself, no, Amy, like, have some fun. The goal isn't to be 100 years old and have lived the most logical life of all time. There's no reward for that. So sometimes I think about it in terms of that, like, when I'm 100 years old, what am I going to wish I had done? Maybe it is buy that thing, take the chance, take a risk, eat the cake instead of the hamburger first, or whatever it is you want to do, but to live a little. So I think sometimes just putting things in perspective that way can be like, all right, there is no reward at the end of life for living the most logical life possible.
So, points well taken. Along the same line here, same topic. It's interesting because when I think therapy, or when anyone thinks therapy, they're perhaps only thinking about the emotional side of it, or working through the emotional side of what we just talked about. Are you ever working with somebody and probably the answer is yes, but talk us through this. If you're working through somebody who is all emotion and no logic, are you helping build up, are you helping sprinkle in some logic and rationality around some of their emotions? Because I have a hard time, I tend to skew more logical. So, and I'm also a sales coach, and I work very directly with early professionals. I have a harder time, or a more difficult time, working with somebody who is very emotional and has scarcity in logic. Is that a huge proponent of being a therapist as well?
Yeah, we certainly see plenty of those people too. Say, like, I met this person on the internet. We've only talked 3 times, but I'm 100% positive this is true love, so I'm going to get on a bus tomorrow. Not a problem. And then 2 weeks later, like, well, that didn't work out, but guess what? I've already met somebody else. And it's not just with love, it's with money, it's with their job. Like, I went to work 3 days and I decided this career wasn't for me, so I'm going to find something else that I'm going to go do now. But they do that constantly. So just knowing, that if you're somebody like that and you can't just do what feels good in the moment. So sometimes we have a list of things, so we'll, again, write things down. And I had a person I worked with who said, I'd like to go to the gym and I'd like to be a fit person. But at the end of my work day, I'm like, I'm kind of tired. So I just turn right out of the work parking lot and I go straight home. And I'm like, I'll do it tomorrow. But he said, tomorrow I never feel good about going to the gym tomorrow, so it just never happens. So we wrote a list of here's the top 10 reasons why you should go to the gym. We taped it to his steering wheel, and before he started his car, he would read that list, and it introduced more logic into, all right, you're tired, but you can still go to the gym for 25 minutes, it's fine. And then he could talk himself into it. Or I had a woman that I worked with who had an ex that used to call her, and she'd pick up the phone when he would call because she was excited when she'd see his number on her phone. She said, I know he's not good for me. Like, it's not going to go well. We're going to have this phone call, and then he's going to want to meet up, and things go terrible. And he's bad for me. This is why we broke up. But I can't help it. I get so excited when I see his number on my phone. So we created a list of like the 10 reasons why she shouldn't answer when he called, and she taped it to the back of her phone. And she agreed, at least before she picked up, she would read through that list. And usually she'd get to like number 4 on the list on the back of her phone, and she's like, oh yeah, I don't want to talk to him. And she could then resist not answering the phone. Or somebody else who had depression, and he said, I wake up and I feel awful, so I don't go to work. But I've called into work so many times, now I'm kind of in trouble. So we made a deal of, you're at least going to call my answering machine at my office, and you're going to leave me a message. And we scripted it. And it said, like, I know that going to work today is actually good for my depression. If I stay home and I stay in bed all day, I'm going to feel worse, and then I'm going to feel guilty about not going to work. We had this whole script. And so one day he called the office. He got about halfway through the script, and he was all, this is stupid. I'm just going into work. And he hangs up. And he pushes himself to go into work. But when people really struggle with the logical side of things, sometimes we'll do that. We'll just create a list and say, when your emotions go up, read this list, and it will help with your logic.
It makes total sense. I guess the last topic I want to cover is maybe just the idea of discomfort, and how, because I think again it's a topic that a lot of people maybe struggle with, but like, how can we become more comfortable with getting uncomfortable? How can we take that first step, for people that are maybe stuck and know, I think you kind of alluded to it in one of your examples, they kind of know what they're doing isn't working, but they just can't get themselves to go and take that initial step. Like, what would you suggest to those people? How can we become more comfortable with actually being uncomfortable?
Yeah, so I think a couple things. One is that the first step you take can be a pretty small one. And, even if you let's use the gym example just because that's an easy, concrete one. Somebody says, I'd love to go to the gym, but I'm really nervous about getting myself there. So 3 years later, I still haven't done it. You don't have to sign up for a gym membership. Just ask for a tour or walk in the door. Go park in the parking lot for one day. So a lot of what I do as a therapist is just helping people identify, what's the smallest step you could take? Mm-hmm. And sometimes it's like, I'm going to spend a week researching this thing before I actually do anything else. Researching is an action. And then we can also tackle it from your mindset. So for people who are thinking, I can't stand this, that's not helpful. So then we're going to say, well, what would you say to a friend who said, I can't stand this, I can't do this, I can't possibly do that thing? Well, I'd tell them maybe you can, and here's why. Okay, well then we're going to practice making sure that you start to give yourself those same kind words, because when you talk yourself, use a little self-compassion and you give yourself that pep talk, it can make something that's a little uncomfortable feel like a little bit more tolerable. And then also when it comes to the emotional aspect is to know that a little bit of discomfort has benefits. So sometimes we'll say, well, what's the benefits of having a little bit of discomfort? Well, if I push myself to do this thing a little bit, then eventually I'll feel better. Or here's what I want out of life, like the why of why you want to do something, why it's important to do it. Again, if we were to write a list of here's the top 10 reasons why I should do this, and then to know that, yeah, it eventually gets easier. So on a scale of 1 to 10 of discomfort, we'll often start with like a 3 or a 4. But then once you do that thing that's a little bit uncomfortable for a couple of weeks, like that thing that used to be a 3 or a 4 on the scale drops down to like a 1, and then we find something else to do, and you just keep taking small steps until you get up to that big thing that you want to do.
And does that make you more fearless just at an aggregate level, let's say? And so because you were able to overcome one aspect, now you're just a little bit more armored or feel more equipped to then kind of just tackle things more broadly, maybe even unrelated?
Absolutely. I think one of the best things in life is to ask yourself, like, what's something hard I did before and how did I get through it? And you just are reminded, like, you have inner strength and skills and resources and more mental strength than you give yourself credit for. So when you can do one thing, it applies to other areas of your life. I know for me personally, public speaking was my biggest fear for almost my entire life. The thought of speaking in front of 3 people was terrifying. And now I have a podcast and I do a lot of public speaking and things like that. And I think if I could conquer that, like, there's so many things in life that I know that I can do and I can get out there and do it. And even though it might feel uncomfortable, you never know what might happen.
No, I just love that you said that, because I use that same tactic when it, for me, whenever I'm thinking about, maybe I'm feeling a little fearful of doing something, I just think about, being like coming out, for example. For me, it's like, I was able to do something that I thought about every single day for 26 years of my life. If I can do that, then I can do this thing, and that's why I get a little bit frustrated when, I started doing comedy improv, and whenever I tell someone that I do it, they're 85% of the time the reaction is, oh, I could never do that.
Right.
And it's like, you could, you're in a class with 15 other people that are having those same thoughts, and so that I totally relate.
And it's not even so much that like you want them to be doing improv. It's the mentality that you see in that person that you're like, gosh, you're just holding yourself back from so much more that you could be exploring in life. And that's just the clarity point there. It's not so much about, oh, of course you could do improv, it's not even about improv. It's just the mentality and that's ultimately why we pick up the microphone every so often here. It's to have these kinds of conversations so that somebody who's listening can help hear this conversation and help themselves take a kind of a step forward in whatever it is that maybe is blocking them.
So Amy, when you hear I can't do that, what is your response to someone? Or I could never do that.
Again, there's like there is a limit. Like some people are like, oh, you can do anything you set your mind to. I'm pretty sure I can't be an NFL player no matter what I do in life. And so I'm all about accepting limits or saying, like even if I'd really tried my hardest to be an astronaut, I'm not sure that would have ever happened. And I'm okay with that. But on the other hand, something like improv, like what's the worst that's going to happen? I'm going to embarrass myself. Like I guarantee I will if you put me on stage right now, but like, that's okay. I can stand that. So just knowing like, well, if you did try, like what's the worst thing that could happen? Failure, you get rejected. Like, those things are all tolerable.
And they're all temporary.
Right.
Last thing I wanted to talk about, shifting gears, if that's okay, is just the locus of control piece. My favorite part of the book. I identified myself as having a very internal sense of locus of control. I think it's served me well just being an athlete, being now in sales, now sales coaching, and more so even being a sales leader and just being in a leadership role where very big into the mentality of extreme ownership. How do I make everything my fault? And if everybody has that mentality, then we're all going to be a little bit more solution-oriented, inward reflecting. And I was going through the list of the questions. There's like an assessment in the book to see if you check any of the boxes to try to assess for your locus of control. And there was one I checked, and then when I looked back at it, I saw the word entirely. Like, no, not everything is entirely in your control. So I had to like change the check to an X mark. And then it had me thinking like, okay, since I'm so, I don't know how to describe this, like very internally or have a high internal locus of control, does this affect now my compatibility with somebody who's on the opposite end of that spectrum? Or, have you noticed that there's an interpersonal component here where between intimate relationships or coach to student, employer to employee, is there an interpersonal compatibility component when it comes to somebody who maybe has a more internal locus of control, and advice on how to work with somebody who's maybe got a more external woe is me type locus of control?
Yeah. Oh, those are good questions. So I think it's all about the exceptions to the rule. So somebody who, if we gave a test to a student, somebody with an extreme internal locus of control is going to take 100% responsibility for how they do on the test. I got an A versus I got an F. Somebody who has an external locus of control is going to blame the teacher. Well, the test was really easy. Or the teacher gave us a really hard test and didn't tell us what to prepare for, or isn't a good job teaching us because we didn't know any of this information. So as we walk through life, it's sort of like one of those spectrum things. Like if I apply for a job and I get hired, is it because I was amazing at the interview, or is it because they were desperate and they needed somebody? Or if I don't get hired, is it because I blew the interview, or is it because the boss hired their cousin anyway and they weren't actually hiring? When we walk through life, we draw all of these conclusions about either ourselves or about the world. So I do think it's important to talk to other people and get a better impression of where they fall on that spectrum, in what areas of their life. Financially, they might say, it doesn't matter what you do with money because the government's going to take it all in the end. So if somebody has an extreme external locus of control, and you're an extreme saver who's like, no, I'm going to meet all these retirement goals and I'm going to have a lot of money by the time I get to be such and such an age, probably not going to work out well. And so even though we don't walk around talking about, hey, where do you fall on this spectrum of internal versus external locus of control, you'll find out pretty easily where other people are, even if you don't put it in those terms, just in terms of how they respond to life and, a flat tire or everyday experiences. If their flights canceled or delayed, like how do they respond to that versus how do you respond to it? You get a pretty good sense quickly.
Very well said. I think we're going to wrap up here. Amy, I just wanted to, first of all, thank you so much for coming on here, just providing your wisdom, and being so open. We really appreciate it. We're going to wrap up with 3 rapid fire questions. So just kind of whatever comes to the top of your head first. So the first question is, what is the best piece of advice you've ever received, or just like a favorite quote?
I would say don't speak unless you can improve the silence.
Oh, we haven't gotten that one.
Okay. We've been speaking a lot in here. But
I know. As I'm thinking, I probably just broke that rule for the last hour, but...
No, that's great. Secondly, and this one always seems to stump people. They either have an answer right away or they have to think about it. If you could have dinner with anyone in the world, who would it be and why?
Yeah, I'm in that category of, boy, who would I have dinner with? I would say, oh, boy, I don't know. That's a tough one. Maybe I would just pick like a chef who could then tell me how to cook as we're eating their food.
Guy Fieri.
Right, exactly.
Gordon Ramsay, would he be a pleasant guest?
Oh, yeah, we'll go with Gordon. He'd be fun in terms of being a therapist too to talk to. So thanks for the help. I'm going to say Gordon Ramsay.
All right, and lastly, what do you just some hobbies, free time? What do you like to do with your free time?
So I live on a sailboat, so a lot of my spare time is spent doing anything outside, but sailing is like kind of slow and quiet, and that's great and all, but I really love jet skiing and doing things that are kind of fast paced on the water as well.
Walk me through really quickly, like the day in the life of Amy on a sailboat. What does it look like?
So it's pretty much like a small apartment would be. So we podcast from the boat, and I'm normally tied to a dock in a marina so that I'm not floating all around in the ocean or bobbing all around, and I need fast internet. So a lot of what we do would be the same as if you lived in a small apartment. It's just my backyard happens to be water, and I have a little boat and a jet ski that I can take out anytime. The ocean's just around the corner. I'm kind of ducked in a canal, but we can also take out the bigger boat when we want to, and we can disconnect from the internet and power sources and such.
That's awesome. Okay, well, again, thank you, Amy, so much for this conversation, and thank you all for listening.